I'm Alison Baulos, and on behalf of the Networking and Professional Development Committee of the Alumni Association of the University of Chicago Social Service Administration, I want to welcome you to this evening's event, a conversation on suspensions and expulsions for children of color in early childhood programs. I want to thank our panelists in advance for their unique points of view on this topic, and also to the Ounce of Prevention Fund for allowing us to meet here in this space. So for this evening's program, I will share some of the research out of my center at the University of Chicago to offer a foundation for why the issue of suspensions and expulsions in early childhood programs is such an important one and really misses massive opportunities to give the most vulnerable members of our society a fair chance at school and in life. Then Alison Lowe-Fotos, policy manager here at the Ounce of Prevention Fund, will provide an understanding and framework by explaining some of the data and public policies around this issue. Then Michelle Lee-Murrah, infant mental health specialist at the Erikson Institute and Fussy Baby Network, will draw from her experience as an infant mental health specialist and former kindergarten teacher to offer context on the clinical aspects of this issue. And then Edgar Ramirez, who's president and CEO of Chicago Commons, will offer his perspective, drawing from his experiences as a leader of a social service program that works with young children and families and communities of color. And there's more information that was provided at the registration table about their organizations and their bios. Great, so then I would like you guys to keep in mind any questions you have on this topic so we can cap off the evening with an engaging discussion. Since 2005, I've been working with an interdisciplinary group of scholars on evaluations and studies of early childhood programs at the University of Chicago. In particular, I work with Nobel Prize-winning economist, Professor James Heckman, and we co-founded something called the Center for the Economics of Human Development. The importance of quality early childhood investments for children, families, and society as a whole is still an emerging policy agenda item. And I'm proud that the research from our center has helped move literally billions of public and private dollars across the globe into early childhood programs. Programs such as home visiting programs with first-time moms, some of which run out of the ounce, and subsidies for prenatal care and quality child care, and state pre-K programs. So, of course, developmental psychologists and social justice advocates and others, such as those that founded Head Start, have been supporting early childhood programs as a way to promote intergenerational mobility for decades. But social science research is just catching up to help us understand the long-term evidence and the mechanisms that drive the outcomes of these investments. So just kind of to set the stage, there's some graphs in here, but don't worry, we'll glance over them quickly. So as we know, in America, we're facing growing inequality. There are still really high rates of children born into poverty, many of which to single moms, and most of which we know are working, and they're spending a significant proportion of their income on childcare costs, up to 30% or more. At the same time, we see a significant achievement gap, and it starts early. At school entry, we're already seeing disparities, and these persist unless we intervene. So luckily, evaluations of some programs show that indeed we can close these gaps by investing early. And we see the gains through skill development through multiple areas. So some of the things that are surprising are that we see effects on health long-term in adulthood at age 35. So as you can imagine, this drives a really high economic return to early childhood investments through things such as decreasing diabetes and blood pressure and metabolic syndrome. And the returns that we see, at least newest research out of our center, shows a 13.7% return to society for investments in these programs, 0 to 5. And again, we of course need to invest across the life cycle, but starting early is where you're going to get the highest return. So if we think about investing and then developing skills, you want to develop them in multiple areas, and you'll hear more about that from the panel. And then we want to sustain those. Of course, it's not only about moving dollars into early childhood programs, but to sustaining those. You build a solid foundation, and then that drives outcomes. And so there's some of the work. There's something called the Heckman Equation, heckmanequation.org. So I know a lot of advocates already use the resources there, but you can go to the website and download certain things that you can use in your efforts. And so with that, I will move it over to Allie to tell us more.
Thanks. Thanks for having me here tonight. As Allison said, I'm a policy manager here at the OUNCE. I'm not going to go over our mission because you probably got it in some of the materials, but we really consider at the OUNCE our successful approach to be multidisciplinary. So we have our programs that we fund, professional development that trains the workforce, our research department, and then our policy and advocacy department. And we really feel like all of these tie in together and inform each other's work, and it's how I do my work personally as well, because I come from a clinical background and always worked in early childhood programs working with kids and families before coming to policy, and I don't feel like I could do my policy work as well without having that direct client experience. And I'm able to continue that a lot in my policy work because of our organization, because all of our divisions really collaborate and work together to inform each other's work. But I'm happy to be here to talk about expulsion and suspension. It's an issue that I've been working on for probably about close to 3 years now. And so why are we talking about it? I think most people, when you say young kids are getting expelled, they're like, what, that's a thing? But in 2014, there was a lot of federal attention focused on it with My Brother's Keeper, some joint policy statements from Health and Human Services and Department of Ed, the revised Head Start performance standards, which Head Start has never condoned or allowed expulsions, but in 2014 they wanted to come out with much more strongly worded language around it. The Every Student Succeeds Act talks about it, and then in 2014 this was the first time in the Child Care Development Block Grant that it was mentioned as well. But Walter Gilliam is probably the most famous person that you'll hear associated with it. And in his 2005 landmark study, he found this was where we really found that this was happening at alarming rates, and in particular with certain groups. So kindergarten or preschoolers were 3 times more likely to be expelled than their K-12 counterparts, and it's most likely boys of color who are getting disproportionately expelled. And while Illinois reported the 6th lowest expulsion rate, we're still 3 times as likely to expel our preschoolers. But even before that, in 2002, there was a study actually out of Erikson Institute that looked at child care programs, and so birth to 3 programs, and they found high numbers as well. So 40% of child care programs asking a child to leave due to emotional and behavioral problems, and so the most common listed were things like biting and hitting and aggressive behavior, and if any of you know infants and toddlers, that's pretty developmentally appropriate, but these kids were still getting kicked out. And then again in 2014, data again just reinforced what Walter Gilliam had found 10 years earlier, that again it was more likely boys of color who were getting kicked out. And again, the same thing in the Office of Civil Rights data collection as well. And I believe in this data set, they found a slight increase in African American girls as well getting kicked out. And so why should we address it? Well, if you come from the early childhood background, you know that any time out of the classroom is detrimental to child outcomes. We've already talked about their higher rates in preschool. And we know that early expulsion predicts it in later grades, as well as high school dropout and incarceration as well. And there's absolutely no research that's linked to the effectiveness of expulsion. Just simply telling a child to leave does nothing to address the problem or the issue. And then we've talked about the racial and gender disparities, and to me that is the biggest reason for why we should address it, because if we're leaving behind certain groups, then that's completely unacceptable. And so there are a lot of causes. When I do this presentation, I talk about this for about 2 hours, and I can go into depth on each one of these bullet points. I only have 15 minutes here. But basically, early childhood education can be implemented really differently. It's a less formal process. Kids aren't mandated to be there like K through 12. There are few formal definitions of what expulsion and suspension are. We also know that certain program characteristics contribute to it. So if it's a longer program day, if there's a higher teacher-child ratio, if the environment's really open or too restrictive. Teacher job stress has also been linked to higher expulsion rates. And then another possible cause is lack of support of the workforce, because I was just talking about that Chicago study where, the infants and toddlers were getting kicked out, and so a lot of it is lack of knowledge of basic things like child development, things like trauma, and so there's a huge training and professional development piece that needs to happen. But when I talk about lack of support of the workforce, I also don't want teachers to feel like we're blaming them all of the time, because we need those supportive policies and practices to help them as well. If we're talking about job stress, if a teacher's really stressed out in her classroom and has to deal with 20 high-needs kids, that's a lot. We ask our teachers to do a lot in early childhood programs. Absolutely. We ask them to be highly educated. Many of them have at least bachelor's, sometimes master's, and we don't pay them very well at all. Okay. A lot of our early childhood workforce is on public benefits themselves, and so if they're worried about feeding their own families, how are they going to attune to all of those kids in the classroom? And then things like adequate break time. They really need some time for themselves to be out of the classroom. If you've got a lot of kids who have challenging behaviors, that's exhausting. Even easy kids, that many easy kids for a full day is really hard. So time out of the classroom to just take a break, get your work done, have some lunch is really important. And then interpreting kids' behavior is really subjective. So I quote Walter Gilliam a lot because he speaks about it so well. And one of my favorite quotes is he says that expulsion is not a child's behavior, it's an adult's decision. And when you're working with a child, challenging behavior can be a lot of different things. It's what do you consider challenging? It can be, do you consider it cursing? Do you consider it crying? Is it physically harming yourself or someone else? And that's a huge range of behaviors, and it can change from day to day. I know as a parent of a toddler, how I respond to her might be different from day to day if I'm tired or hungry, and so it's the same, I think, for a teacher. Also, trauma can manifest as a lot of different things, and so kids who come to school suffering from trauma, they're less ready to learn, they can't concentrate as much. They might be more defiant, they might mistrust adults or rules and regulations, and so their behavior might be perceived as particularly challenging. And then there's a huge implicit bias piece, and this is a sticky point of conversation that not a lot of people like to get into, or I feel like we get right up to the door and then we don't push past it, but it's really important to bring up in this issue because you see the statistics of who's getting expelled disproportionately. And there are tons of studies that I could go into that talk about how we interpret different kids' behavior differently based on implicit bias. Walter Gilliam did complete a study about a year ago that really measured this as well and tracked teachers' eye movements and as they watched videos. There's also a lot of studies around how we view children of color as older than their white counterparts. And so there's a lot of research behind this. The way I like to talk about it, again, is I don't want people to get defensive. I think we need to feel more comfortable talking about this issue and recognize that, first of all, it happens in everybody. No one's immune from it, and it's unconscious. And often it does not align with who we are as a person. So just because we have these implicit biases doesn't mean that that's who we are as a person deep down. It can also be about good things as well as bad things. And then we also, in times of stress, tend to fall back on our implicit biases more. And so when we're talking about teachers being stressed out in the classroom, that might contribute to some of the reasons. Inefficient family engagement approaches also. Again, Walter Gilliam says that he has never seen an expulsion in a program where the teacher and the families got along. That's not always possible. There's always going to be that family that you can't reach or that child that you can't help. But if you're truly engaging with a family, it's all about empathy. So if you know more about that family situation, you're more likely to understand what's going on with that child and be willing to work with them or be able to correctly find them services that they may need, and really just partner with that family. But again, a lot of training in PD is needed around this because higher ed has not done a great job of training our workforce to really engage with families. I think a lot of us go into this field because we want to work with kids and we love kids, but probably 75% of our job is working with adults, whether you're working with that parent or you're a supervisor who's working with a teacher. And so being able to really engage with that family and partner with them and be creative. And again, programs sometimes get a little defensive when I talk about this as well, because they'll say, well, I'm doing everything I can, but that mom's just not doing what she should. And I ask people, again, to be really reflective in this instance, because it's, what is it that's appearing like she's not engaging? Are we just not offering the right opportunities, or is she just really busy? Does she prefer email? Is she a teen mom who's on public aid and gets her cell phone from public aid and she only gets 30 minutes a month and she's already blown through them and now I can't get a hold of her? So really being creative and reflective and partnering with the family. And I'm sure my coworker, my counter panelists can talk about a lot more about the family engagement piece. But then this final bullet point is one that I also think that we in policy sometimes forget. It's that macro level. It's the lack of resources. So I like to describe the expulsion issue as a perfect storm of four things. It's that child's behavior, it's the family situation, it's the program's response, and then it's that macro state level. What is our responsibility as a state to help solve this issue? And so it is providing things like the supports for the workforce, the training, the professional development, the services for the kids who need it, the families who need it. And so how are we addressing it at all of the different levels? And so currently we've talked a little bit about the federal level, but here in Illinois we had a few precedents that we could build off of. So the Chicago Public Schools revised their code of conduct in 2014 and said that pre-K through second grade could not be expelled or suspended. And then Senate Bill 100 was also in 2014, which was the K through 12 discipline bill. And then the Senate Bill 2793 was the accompanying data collection piece that asked schools, districts to report out on their disciplinary policies. And so here, while SB 100 was a huge step forward and was really great, the early childhood advocates really felt like it didn't go far enough to specifically address early childhood. And since the rates are actually higher in early childhood, the advocate organizations really wanted to have a specific piece of legislation that addressed that and that would encompass all areas of early childhood. So not just state-funded pre-K, but child care as well. And again, Head Start, which has never allowed expulsion, but would be included in this legislation. And so groups like the Ounce and Action for Children, who Maria is a part of, Maria's also been working on this with me for many years, Voices for Illinois Children, Latino Policy Forum, Shriver Center, Fight Crime Illinois, we all got together and kind of drafted some language based off the Head Start performance standards. And really, I think the key to our success was that we spent a good 2 years just shopping it around to anybody and everybody who would listen. We talked to programs, we talked to families, we talked to state agencies, unions, school management groups, teachers, anybody, and revised it and really got buy-in and feedback so that we could just all be on the same page and all get behind it. And then introduced it in January of last year. Senator Lightford was our key sponsor in the Senate, and I can't remember how many we ended up having sign on, but it was in the teens or 20s. And then in the House, it was Representative Stratton, and we had many more co-sponsors there. And it passed last May and was signed into law last August. And so technically it went into effect January 1st. And basically the goals are these three things: to ensure that programs engage in best practice in their disciplinary actions by prohibiting expulsions of young children due to their behavior; also to connect providers to existing available resources and supports; and then there's a big data collection piece as well, so asking the state to track transitions, because one thing I forgot to mention is in early childhood, there's it's kind of different from K through 12. There's what we call soft expulsions. And so while it's technically not considered or defined as an expulsion, it's like, hey, maybe Johnny's not a good fit for this classroom, maybe you should leave, and the parent leaves. Or if a parent's getting called every day to come pick up their child early, they're going to get frustrated and they're going to leave. Or if 10 other parents in that classroom are like, that kid is biting my kid every single day, you need to kick him out. And so the data collection piece really wanted to get at that soft expulsion issue and ask programs to track the number of families who are leaving and the reasons why. So that we can't, because if you say you can't expel, I mean, that number is always going to be 0. That's not going to tell us anything. So we're trying to collect some data points that might actually get a little bit more deep into the issue. And so the legislation applies to these programs. So programs receiving early childhood block grant funds, so Preschool for All and Prevention Initiative. Also licensed child care centers and homes, and that's the piece that I'm the most excited about, because when we started this, I never thought we'd be able to get it into the licensing, and Maria actually had a lot to do with that because she worked really closely with DCFS licensing from the get-go to get their feedback, and they found a little piece in licensing already about transitions, and so since there was already kind of some groundwork there, we didn't think that it was that much of a push to actually get it written into licensing. And again, Head Start and Early Head Start. And so the legislation states that when a child exhibits consistently challenging behaviors, the ECE provider must document initial observations, communication. There's a huge parent engagement piece in this, asking that the programs have been talking to the parents from the beginning. There's a recently published report of a professor here in Chicago who had interviewed families of kids who got expelled, and a lot of them, I think it was like 70% of them, the parent was like, my kid getting kicked out was the first time they called me and said that something was wrong. And they'd been acting out for like 2 weeks or more. And so there's a huge parent engagement piece in the legislation that asks that the parents be a part of the whole process as well, so that any intervention plans and attempts to access resources and instances eventually where the child is ultimately transitioned out. But in the legislation, we want to leave it open too, because we don't want to say that every child needs to stay in an early childhood, that particular program. It might not be a good fit. We're not saying that they'd have to stay there. We're just asking that there's a process in place before it happens and that there's an actual transition. And so if available resources have been exhausted and the provider determines that transitioning the child to another setting is best, then they work with the family to identify a different setting, so including referrals to other providers and any planning, and if possible, with the new provider. There is a flexibility in here around serious safety threat. Because we got a lot of questions about that. And so if the child does pose an immediate threat to safety, they can be temporarily removed, but with the understanding that the same intervention process would need to be triggered, like immediately contacting your available resources, also the parent, and that the child be returned to the group setting as quickly as possible. And so the Governor's Office of Early Childhood Development, so I mentioned that the legislation went into effect in January, but right now we're still in kind of a gray area because the state agencies are writing the rules. And so the Governor's Office of Early Childhood, through the interagency team, which is comprised of all the state heads of all the state agencies, are working together to write the rules, because what we didn't want to happen was ISB to write rules for state-funded pre-K programs and then DCFS to write something different for childcare and everyone be held to different standards. So the legislation actually asked that all of the state agencies work together to write the rules. And I have to say it's been going pretty quickly, and we've been able to sit in on some work groups, the advocate organizations, to help them as they come up with definitions for a lot of these things, and been pleasantly surprised that it's been very collaborative and nice, and they've been listening to the early childhood people, and if they don't come from that background, they kind of drink the Kool-Aid. They're like, oh yeah, okay, I get what you're saying. And so OECD is also working with them as they try to figure out how they're going to start collecting all the data, because we are asking for a few new data points to be collected, and so that's a little tricky. And then identifying resources so that the programs can actually address the issue, because we can't say that you can't expel and then not provide the resources. There is no funding attached to this legislation, but that's a more long-term goal. But there are some best practices and resources that are currently available. It's just that programs don't always know that they exist. And so the legislation asks that the state agencies make sure that as many programs as possible know that a lot of these resources exist, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about best practices. So right now, the rules are being drafted. I think they're pretty close to being posted. And so once they're posted publicly, they'll be available for public comment, and all of us are going to blast it out so that everyone can go look and provide feedback. Hopefully they took our suggestions on our definitions of things like challenging behavior and serious safety threat and intervention plan, but I can't guarantee that for sure. We'll just have to see when they post it. And then once they collect all the feedback, they'll revise it based off that feedback. I think they post it again for second comment. So it's still a long process, but like I said, it's actually going more quickly than a lot of other. I mean, I've seen legislation that has taken like 7 years to get the rules written. So this is moving pretty quickly if you think about it. And so all of the advocate organizations are working, still very committed. We're in it for the long haul. I think this has been a really great piece of legislation that's kind of a new approach, or maybe not a new approach, but an interesting approach to policy making, where we're really trying to be reflective and not say that, okay, we did the hard work, we got the legislation passed, check, we're done, we solved the problem. We're in it for the long haul. We're in it to make sure that eventually those other resources we need to advocate for more. And policy, I think this policy is rooted in best practice as it should be, but no matter how well-intentioned a policy is, it's going to impact different people differently in ways that you don't expect. There are going to be unintended consequences. For instance, we've already heard some programs say things like, well, if you tell me I can't expel, I'm not going to enroll that child in the first place, which is not what we want to happen. And so just being on the lookout for certain things, or as we're staying engaged with the field as it's being implemented, hearing what's happening on the ground, and if we need to change things, we need to change things. Because what works today might not work 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Funding changes, communities change, issues change, and so I think this has been a really great process with this particular piece of legislation. And then I think, too, what's made it successful so far, I mentioned that currently there's not funding attached to it, but there's a huge collaborative effort around the state, and as we're making presentations and increasing public awareness around this, we're presenting to a lot of the groups that could provide some of these resources. So an example would be, I'm on the Illinois Childhood Trauma Coalition, and that's a huge member organization of groups that provide a lot of trauma training and trauma services, and they've already said, how can we help with this implementation? At the very least, the state agencies could just blast out the listserv of all of these trauma coalition organizations and the trainings that they provide. Just to get that information out. So I think that's been another creative thing that's been happening here in Illinois around the legislation. And so we can go into best practices later because Edgar and Michelle will be talking about some of these specifically. In particular, infant and early childhood mental health consultation, which Michelle does a lot of, and developmental screening, and I'm sure Edgar can talk a lot about the family engagement piece and high quality programs. So I'll just throw it over to them.
Great. So good evening. I'm Michelle, and I'm with the Fussy Baby Network, and we are a program that provides services to families who have infants with feeding, sleeping, and crying concerns. So we primarily focus our work on birth to one. We've certainly extended it. I do work in birth to 3 when I go out and do presentations and work with parents, but we're primarily a home visiting program, and most of our home visits focus on that birth to 1. And you might be wondering, well, okay, birth to 1, what does that have to do? How do we make that a pipeline to preschool expulsion? So we'll get to that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work and how it was started. So the Fussy Baby Network was developed by Dr. Linda Gilkerson of the Erikson Institute, who a lot of her research has centered around infancy. And this program was really born out of her personal interest because her own child was really, really fussy baby, and, you know, he was very healthy. She remembered bringing him to the emergency room, and, you know, he was very healthy physically, but the family was really struggling emotionally. They were struggling to connect with him because he was just fussy all the time, dysregulated, hard to read, and so they weren't really enjoying their baby. So, you know, while he was healthy and physically, the relationship between he and his parents were, you know, at risk of not being so. So, you know, eventually they figured it out, but, you know, Linda had always had this hope of, you know, families really need support around these issues. And oftentimes what happens is many times we see these problems manifest in preschool. We see preschoolers and we see these issues, you know, and we'll talk a little bit about looking at them from a more surface level, but sometimes we often don't think about that earlier period where there were some things being set up early on or some things going on that sort of led to some of these issues that we see. And so we like to think of ourselves as like a tier 1, tier 2 program. If you think of like levels of intervention kind of from a public health model where we're prevention and we're that second tier kind of intervention. We're not necessarily doing we're not doing trauma work, CPP, the intensive therapy, but we're going into homes and we're working with families around the feeding, sleeping, and crying concerns. And more importantly, we do it from a relationship-based model. And you'll hear a lot of coming from me at least talking about relationship-based interventions, because I think that that's a lot of what has to happen when we're dealing with kids in preschool with behavioral issues. So our model is, you know, we usually get in the home, a family has an urgent concern, and it's based on if they're struggling, not our own sort of subjective opinion. So we may hear a family talk about something and think, well, that's kind of normal, but if the family's saying, but we're struggling with it, we get in that home and we try to work with them. Our average is usually 2 visits. Sometimes it's longer if we have a family that has more mental health issues or they're not connected with other services. And normally our visits we start off by asking, you know, what's it been like for you to care for your child? That is our stance that we start off with. We don't come in starting off diagnosing. We don't come in being really didactic. We want to get an idea of what their felt experience is. And, you know, a lot of times families often, you know, stop and think because no one has really asked them that, or they haven't really felt safe to talk about those feelings. And it kind of opens it up for, you know, we're sort of building a relationship with that family at this point. And so then, you know, we next in our model, you know, we often then want to hear their story. We look at them as the experts in what's going on. And so they'll, you know, tell us what they've tried, what they've done, and then so on and so forth. And then, you know, we try to together come up with either a plan or just something that, you know, they think might be helpful in terms of soothing their baby. Now, why would all this be important? Now, why would it be important to have babies who are calm and regulated? They're not always going to be that way, and we don't expect them to be, but why would that kind of be important? Well, we know that children have to be emotionally regulated, and it depends on responsive caregiving, where children are regularly expressing connectedness and engagement in their relationship, and that starts at birth. And so when we see preschoolers at that stage where they're getting expelled because they're biting, some of those external behaviors that we see, they're not emotionally and they're not regulated, period. And oftentimes that has started earlier on, or it could be something that started, but usually there are some things going on early on that, you know, have led to that as well. But the idea is the first thing that children have to be is calm. And so Fussy Baby, what we try to do is we try to get families off on that good start in terms of learning how to read their baby's cues. What's your child telling you? And it's the same kind of work that's done as kids get older. But unfortunately, you know, in the classroom, if a teacher has 20 kids, she's not able to maybe spend an hour and a half on a child figuring that out versus someone like Fussy Baby who can go in a home and work upwards of 2 hours with a family and spend time doing this, whether it be weekly or once a month or twice, you know. So that's where the challenge is, but the work is still important and the idea is still the same, is that we first, you know, have to help families learn how to read their children's cues and find ways to connect. So the task that children have, and I'm going to kind of go through these, you know, when we think about what they have to do in preschool, right? And to me, preschool should ultimately be about, yeah, you know, it's learning those things like your letters, your colors, your numbers. But to me, preschool builds and helps build that social engagement foundation, those social skills that children need to have. So a lot of time should be spent on those kinds of issues that they're expelling kids for. It should actually be in preschool where they're trying to work on those and cultivate those things. Unfortunately, though, what's happened is, we've kind of placed more emphasis on a lot of the academic things. And there's a lot of pressure on teachers to perform. And as we know, as they get to kindergarten and beyond, the testing starts. And so there's all that pressure to focus on those kind of things and forget about the emotional needs of the children and the foundation they have to even learn. And so what we've learned over time is that children, and I have kind of a nifty little, I don't know, you can't see it that well, but we kind of look at it from this standpoint of the first level that a child has to have is, calm attention. And that gets established early on at birth. We want to work on those things starting right at birth. And then if a child can have calm attention, which usually involves just, we're thinking this is by 3 months of age. They're able to make good eye contact with their caregiver. They're able to track and focus. And then we say that then the next step would be, okay, now they can learn to become engaged and relate. They can learn to accept comforting contact. They're reaching out for that caregiver now. They're wanting that closeness. Now, this is where the cue reading is coming in at this stage, where the parent is saying, oh, I can tell that you're starting to get upset, so maybe let me shift something. Or, are you getting hungry? Or, oh, is this, I'm noticing that you're kind of shutting down. Is it too stimulating in the environment? So now they're just starting to learn, the parents are starting to learn how to connect with their baby. And then once they're able to have that comfort, they can share joy, express emotions. So you start to see more of that by 5 months, babies with their social smiles and expressing enjoyment and, wanting to interact. And then if they can do that, then now they're starting to do what we call, which is one of the most important steps is when we think of tennis, serve and return. So now they're able to kind of have these back and forth engagements where, kids are starting to learn that, cause and effect. If I do something, it'll have an effect. So if I smile at my caregiver, I'll give a smile back. So I'm going to keep doing those same things that elicit those healthy responses. And then eventually that'll lead to learning how to read nonverbal cues, right? And being in flow and reading gestural cues. Then eventually children will be able to express those emotions verbally as they start to learn to talk. And then that leads to a higher level of problem solving. So what you can see is that nurturing these kind of pro-adaptive behaviors that we want to see in preschool happen early. And intervention in the earliest phases is critical. So when we have babies where parents are really frustrated and their babies are crying and it's a detriment to their connecting. You realize then they're not able to get their baby in a calm state where they can make that eye contact. And then they don't have a baby that's really giving them those smiles and then they learn to smile back. They may, a lot of parents often have a hard time reading their infants. So if they're misreading, miscuing or not reading the right cues, that's an issue as well. So then both the parent and the child, or the caregiver, I should say, are not in sync. And so you can see where we want to cultivate these kind of behaviors early on. Sometimes though, what happens is we don't always get there. And so we get children that come to us like in preschool where these needs haven't been met. And so it's in a way we're having to start this over. And in a way, what we're asking a lot of teachers to do is start this process over. Right? Because the school might be the only place they're going to receive this kind of, relationship where they can learn to become emotionally regulated. And so, I like to look at behavior like this. When we think about, preschool expulsions and what I believe happens is, sort of how behavior is looked at in the classroom. And so oftentimes I like to kind of look at, and there's a really good book by Mona Delahook, I actually brought it. And a lot of her work is good because it's written in a way that's real simple to read, but she uses kind of this analogy or this metaphor of like an iceberg. And many of you may have heard it. We, think of the term, the tip of the iceberg. And you have an iceberg where, it sort of sits outside of the water so you can see what's above the water. But then you have a portion of it that's below the surface, right? And so when we think of, behaviors that we see in preschool and things of that nature, we see a lot of the external behaviors, the hitting, the biting, the cursing, the aggressiveness, right? Those are all the things that we can see. Things that we hear about, medical history from the family, those kinds of things. Those are very surface things that we can get. But what tends to happen then is we base sort of this on, well, this child is purposely misbehaving, or those biases you were talking about. Well, if this family has come in and they look a certain way, or, this is a single mother. What are those biases that we have about that? What assumptions do we already make? And the task is to then take what we see at the top of the iceberg and figure out, well, what are some questions we can ask to figure out what's going on underneath? And so what are some of those, what I call below the surface issues that we might be seeing? First of all, I think it's important to look at when we see kids acting out, if we reframe our thinking to more of it being a stress response. Oftentimes children feel that their safety is threatened in some way. Okay, and usually they don't feel safe in that environment, or it's a stress response to something. So if we can somehow shift our thinking in that way, that's kind of the first step. Then the other thing is to think about some of the below the surface issues. And Allie, you mentioned a few of those, but it could be, we know trauma, and trauma can encompass a lot of different things. Sensory issues. Sometimes if teachers or providers aren't well trained into, it could be something going on, from a sensory standpoint. Is the environment overstimulating? Is it understimulated? Is this a child that really reacts really negatively to certain textures, touch, and we don't know that? Those are some underlying things. Physiological needs. Do we know, did they get a good night's sleep? Do we know, could some of these issues be due to sleep? Could they be due to, nutrition? So what are some of the physiological needs? Change in relationships in the home. Do we know what's going on there? Because it could be did mom and dad or the parenting partners recently separate? And there's something going on there. Environmental issues. So it's thinking about those below the surface issues. But how do we get there, right? That's the question. Well, how do we get there to know these things? And oftentimes, I think it takes conversations with families. I think you mentioned that parent engagement. And in our line of work, we do have a parent engagement model. We call it, basically it's a model of attunement. It's trying to attune with families. So we ask a lot of questions. We pretend like we don't know anything that's going on. We're like, we try to, with all our knowledge and all the training we've had, try to become a blank slate and really find out from that parent. Like I started off by saying, what's it been like for you to parent your child? And we may know their medical history. And so it's thinking about, wow, what was that like having a baby who was premature in the NICU? And so you were separated from your baby the first 5 or 6 months. And so you were not able to bond in the same way that maybe a child that comes home from, right from the hospital, right? And so these are all these things, and asking, or, hey, tell me a little bit about your routines at home, or how have things been going at home? Or have you thought about, have you noticed Johnny's behaviors at home? Why do you think it's happening? It often sounds like, based on some of what you've shared about your research, we don't take the time sometimes to, teachers are not able to do that. A lot of it's because, like you were saying, they don't have the time. They have to focus on other things. How do you talk to 20 parents, right? Or how do you even sit down sometimes to call a conference with a parent? And that's where, support has to come in, for providers. Allie was mentioning to you the consultation. One of the things is, if teachers can get it, that what we call that opportunity to reflect with someone. In our line of work, we call it reflective supervision. But oftentimes in child care centers and things, teachers can't get that, right? It would be lovely for someone to sit with them and really just ask them, what's it like for you to have that child in your class? Or what's it like to have 20 kids in your class, no break? Or what do you feel are things you struggle with behavior? What are things you feel you need more training in or want to know more of? Giving teachers that opportunities, we don't. So through mental health consultation, we try to use that mode to help do that and to help wonder with programs and to give them just an opportunity to talk with someone from the outside to reflect on things like that, to help them learn how to look at behaviors and do that kind of below the surface thinking, that we try to do. In my line of work, we're able to do that for 2 hours with the family. But what I think is important is if we can start and do that, then maybe by the time the child gets in preschool, they won't show some of these behaviors. That's the idea. But if we're not able to get there, then how do we help families or how do we help providers do this work if, this child did not have this work early on? And so it's now the job of the caregivers that are in their presence. Sometimes the only place is school, how they can do that. I think it takes, a reframing of how we look at behavior and why kids are responding the way they are. Like I was mentioning, those stress responses. And then I think it's doing some of that below the surface questioning and wondering about those issues as well.
All right, everyone. So I'm just going to talk about the program perspective. Again, I have the privilege and honor to be the CEO of Chicago Commons. A little bit about Chicago Commons. We are a former settlement house. We've been around for 125 years. Our early childhood space has 200 staff in it. We have 4 centers, 4 schools, we'd like to call them, and we have 800 children in those 4 schools. We also manage the Head Start grant. We also offer technical assistance to 9 other community partners who are smaller in size. So they rely on us to manage their back office, but then also that educational technical assistance as well. We have 2 centers on the west side of Chicago. So 2 centers in West Humboldt Park, which are predominantly African-American, is a predominantly African-American neighborhood. And we have about, and I was trying to do the research today, we have about 70 African-American boys in our program, in those 2 schools of ours. You know, we have a no expulsion policy at Commons, but that doesn't absolve us from this soft expulsion issue that we are currently, you know, every program battles against, right? What we'd like to do is develop preventive measures so we can mitigate that soft expulsion. You know, we practice the Reggio Emilia approach at our 4 schools. I'm not sure if all of you know about Reggio Emilia. I'm not an expert. Again, I'm the CEO. I'm not an educator by trade. I'm a social worker by trade. But Reggio Emilia is very similar to Montessori. It's an inquiry-based pedagogy where the tenets of, or the pillars of Reggio are the parent, the environment, the teacher, and then the child. And so the child is a co-constructor of their learning, right? So we honor whatever children's gifts, their knowledge, their history. We honor a child when they come into our classroom as a co-constructor of their learning. There's a lot of efficacy to that, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But for especially boys of color, especially African American boys, that's a not common concept, right? And we realize that. So before starting our program, we require our teachers and what we call our family workers, who act very much as our social workers in our program, to go to the child's house and meet with the family and have a parent meeting. And we do that for a couple of reasons. One, it builds a relationship between the child, the parent, and the lead teacher. 2, we get to develop a profile of that child. And then 3, we break some of the implicit biases or assumptions that whatever staff might have of that child once they enter our schools, right? We know that everybody comes in with biases and assumptions, no matter who you are, right? But the more you develop a context around that individual child, the more we can mitigate that. In our, so I failed to mention that we are an early Head Start program and a Head Start program. So we receive children as early as 8 weeks old, and we have them until 5 years old. But in our 2 to 5 year old classrooms, we ask our children to develop ground rules. So all of them are held accountable to it. And children are amazing people. I mean, they're just amazing beings. They, you know, and I think they're often underestimated. Because you know, our children are very good at holding each other accountable to these rules. Once they're reminded, like, hey, you helped create these rules, right? But that's part of honoring them as the co-constructors of their learning, and this is their space, right? You're helping create this environment. And we emphasize that to the parents as well. And for parents, it often is like, how can you do that? You know, I'm sending you my child to, you know, to shape and form and to be educated, right? But we often, our retort is, you know, we're being educated ourselves by your child, right? And by your experiences. So they have every right to help construct the ground rules for their classroom. And I said, as Commons, we practice the Reggio Emilia approach. You know, we're lucky enough to have a support system that helps with Reggio Emilia at each of our classrooms, right? So we have not only the family workers, We have what we call studio coordinators who help set the environment. As we mentioned, we are very cognizant of an overstimulating environment and what that does to a child. And so we set the room with natural light, with organic material, we won't have billboards in our classrooms. We have a lot of space for children to roam. We encourage a child to go out and show us what he or she is interested in, right? And we provide material for that child to do so, and hopefully that will stimulate them and help us develop a curriculum based on that. We look at our classrooms as an open palette of an open canvas for learning, and we also have outdoor spaces that encourage that as well. We're in heavily urban environments, so we do spend the time to make sure that our children have the proper green space time where they can go and experience green space for calming effect, but also for teaching us what they're interested in as well. Again, we have a support system at our school that we're lucky to have. We have 3 teachers per classroom. Those teachers are one lead teacher who has either master's level or at least bachelor level. We have 2 other teachers that help that teacher construct curriculum on a daily basis. When that teacher or teachers, they each take breaks, so you have adequate time for breaks. They have an hour lunch. They have time to prepare their lesson plans, and they have time afterwards to meet with parents and so forth. If there is an issue with a child, and we've had these issues, and I'll give an example. We had 2 twins in one of our West Homo Park sites, whose mom was addicted to crack, and who was being raised by their grandma. These 2 children had obvious physiological issues, right? That they needed extra help, and we had a mental health provider who went up to a teacher and said, we have to remove, and this is a new mental health provider, we have to remove these 2 kids from this classroom. They told our teacher this. Then that teacher tried to act on it, but administration got involved and said, that's not how we do things at Chicago Commons, right? But we wanted to honor the stressors of that teacher too, right? So what we do when we have issues such as that, we assign a paraprofessional to handle the classroom, not those 2 children. Those 2 children are part of that classroom, right? So we have a paraprofessional work with that classroom. So we have now 4 teachers in that classroom. We have a mental health advisor that does an assessment of that classroom space as well. And then we have a parent meeting to talk about best practice and how we can help those 2 children. So again, we're lucky to have that. A lot of other smaller providers don't have that opportunity. Ongoing training and evaluation. Now, in our early childhood space, we have what we call excellence, quality, and innovation. We have a system of support for teachers that provides ongoing training, mentoring, coaching for our teachers. So we have about a group of 7 staff who go to each classroom and evaluate how teachers are doing, makes critical recommendations, makes sure that they have that reflection time with those teachers to see how their stress levels are, what other extra support they need as a teacher to manage their classroom. These folks also help track data, right? And we also are able to parcel out how and I have our data for our African-American boys right here, how each of them are performing in the classroom and aggregate. And they also help in teacher meetings if special attention is needed to a particular classroom or even a school as well. We also have culturally appropriate curriculum as well. We make sure that we honor the backgrounds, the race, the culture of each of our children, and make sure that's infused in each of our classrooms as well. Lastly, we are lucky to have staff who reflect or represent the neighborhoods we serve. At our 2 West Side sites, we are lucky to have 2 African-American females as school directors, of those schools. For our excellence, quality, and innovation space, that teaching and mentoring, that space, that coaching and mentoring space, an African American female also runs that program as well. So, having key leaders in the space that could relate to the neighborhoods they serve, that relate to the parents and the children is really important to us as well. But again, this is Chicago Commons. This is how historically we've created our space. We're always looking to learn and see what new interventions can occur. One thing that I'll leave you with this, and we'll talk about best practice later, but what a stressor for us right now is the lack of men of color in the early ed space, right? And so, we're lucky to have, I believe, 2 African American male teachers in our program, but it's not enough, right? And we'd love to have more, but I think that's something we can talk about later.
That's something.
Yeah, thanks. So as I mentioned, early childhood programs are still an emerging policy issue. In the United States, over $20 billion a year are spent in child care subsidies and pre-K programs and Head Start and such. So having seen the strength of the returns to early childhood programs for disadvantaged children and knowing we have increasing healthcare costs and achievement gaps that exist, I can't help but think how high suspension and expulsion rates for young children, especially African American boys, contributes to a pathway to prison. The channels and the mechanisms that we see that drive the outcomes, some of the outcomes that I showed, are through socio-emotional skills. So we know that these programs need to be building those, and it will get us there to closing some of these gaps and achieving the returns for society. And we also see in this research, at our center, that there's differences to the effects of programs by gender. So and we see that as well if there's a higher expulsion rates for boys. So there clearly is a link. And early childhood is a equitable and efficient policy. People think of it as a 2-generation policy because you're working with kids and their families, working parents. And this summer out of our center, you'll hear more about us saying it's a 3-generation policy because we're also taking care of people who are going to be future parents, right? So their ability to parent contributes back to the returns of these programs as well. So, so we definitely shouldn't waste the opportunity to invest in our most vulnerable kids. So just some questions for the panel that I have. First, Allie, for you. What resistance do you hear coming from policymakers against some of the policies that you mentioned?
Maria and I can maybe talk a little bit about that, but I feel like we don't get too much resistance. I mean, maybe an initial this is going to be really hard or challenging. But the more I think we've also gotten really good about talking about it and how we talk about it, and so people really get on board. And when we talk about some of the flexibilities within the legislation, that we're not just saying that kid has to stay in that program or you can't do X, Y, and Z. They get a little more comfortable with it. You guys did some lobbying more in Springfield than I did, so
I would say at first I was just surprised this happened. Like, they didn't want to believe us that it was a real problem. But once I understood it, it was a lot of we don't have money for the resources right now. We haven't had a budget for a while. We have one now, but we didn't have the time. And then also just some people that are against mandates of any kind. That was always a pushback. But overall, it passed with overwhelming majorities, so it was fine.
There's surprisingly little resistance. I think because we did spend so many years talking to people first, especially the state agencies, because state agencies don't like being told what to do, especially by outside advocate organizations. So if they feel like they're contributing to the language, and that they have ownership over it, everyone buys into it a lot more. So
this is a national problem. So would you say that Illinois is a leader in this, or what are the other states?
Definitely. There are a lot of other states that have passed legislation. However, I think Illinois is the most comprehensive. It covers all of those sectors of early childhood. We also specifically address implicit bias in there, which I don't think any of the others do really. And then there are a lot of eyes on us right now. But because so many other states are focusing on it, there are a lot of these kind of national cohort and peer learning groups that are being run by organizations like Build. And so I'm actually able to talk to a lot of the other states, and we're kind of learning from each other, because also what works in Illinois might not work in, say, Colorado. Colorado has some pretty good, well, they don't have the legislation yet. California just passed them, though. But we're just learning from each other and how implementation is going as well. So I definitely say we're a leader, but it's also been kind of a nice collaborative process on a national level, too, just hearing what other states are doing and watching each other.
That's encouraging. So, Michelle, Edgar touched on the racial makeup of the workforce. What do you see? Do you think that the race of teachers or clinical specialists matching the family, is that an important part of the work that you do?
So I would say, well, in general, in clinical work, I think it's important. I think race is a factor, but it's one of the factors that I think can affect clinical outcomes. And what's interesting about what the research shows is that race matching is important when it comes to like getting folks in the door for treatment and therapy, and in some ways rates of retention. But ultimately what they have found is it's that therapeutic alliance that's created that has the most effect on clinical outcomes. So it's, approaching the work, trying to, how culturally sensitive and diverse you attempt to be. We all are never 100% at it, but what are our attempts and how do we try to make that happen? How do we try to partner with families, our approach with families? How do we try to get to know what's important to them? So it's that therapeutic alliance that's been shown to be more important. What's interesting when Edgar was talking, though, is that when he mentioned about like not a lot of African-American early childhood, like in the profession of early childhood, a lot of African-American males, that gender matching actually has more of an effect on clinical outcomes, more so than race matching. So it is interesting, that, having more males in that workforce might make a difference. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
And so, Edgar, in leading a program and as large and diverse as yours, you in a leadership position, what challenges do you face? Do you get pushback from teachers, funding streams? Like, what are the biggest
All
streams?
I think again, I'm not an educator, but I respect the profession, and so it's been a good dialogue of what teachers need in the classroom to be fully supported. And to succeed, right? Because someone mentioned this, that accountability is a two-way street, right? That they're expected to provide a high-quality education, high-stress environments, but then they sometimes don't have the right amount of support, and I agree with that. I think that's critical in order to construct a high-quality early learning program. It's not only teachers that need to be hired, but support systems that support that teacher, then also those families that come into the door to be successful, right? And that requires funding. So we have Head Start funding, we have early Head Start funding, state funding, city funding, and whatnot. We have private funding for some of the good Reggio stuff that we have. But in order to maintain that support system, multiple streams of a diverse revenue system have to be in place.
Yeah. So before I open it up to you in the audience, I just, before I forget, will encourage all of you guys to, if you Google Walter Gilliam, Gilliam, you can see some of the talks that he gives out of his organization 0 to 3, and he has some videos. And one of these that I saw was a testimony of a school social worker saying that the tension she had with a teacher of coming in, to work with a child. The teacher wanted to control the behavior in the classroom. The social worker took a different point of view, looked at the child and thought, gosh, we just need to give this kid a hug. So there's that tension. You need to respect both of them. But, some of these schools in high poverty areas, as we know, the resources that they're calling in are police officers, and that's not leading to great outcomes. And so there's some disturbing videos actually of that as well. So with that,
Oscar Barberin's another one who does a lot of research around African American boys, particularly in schools like in pre-K and Head Start. So Who is that? Oscar Barberin.
Barberin, B-A-R-B-A-R-I-N.
He's out of University of Maryland. Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you to our panelists, and we'll open it up for questions from the audience.
I'll be the first. I was in the disability field for about 10 years, and I have a brother with Down syndrome. I was just curious, have you ever encountered any children, or do you, in these programs with Chicago Commons, et cetera, kids with disabilities, or are they referred out, to other agencies, et cetera?
Yeah, we're actually encouraged to have children with disabilities in our program, and so we have about, I would say 10% of our children have some sort of qualified disability, and we have a special case for those children, and we also have more support systems for that child as well. But they're treated as every other child. They're part of the classroom. They're part of the the overall sort of system of what we have at Commons.
Interesting. Wow, that's a pretty high percentage. 10%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're always looking for more too, because it actually, it helps the learning process for other children as well.
Yeah, there's research around inclusive classrooms being beneficial to all kids, not just the kids with special.
Very different from when my brother was born in 1951.
Oh, right. They probably wanted to put him in a special.
Well, it's not. It's high quality programs like Edgar's aren't the norm either. So it's still a big issue.
Absolutely.
Allie knows this data best, but some of what I read about preschool expulsions is that the suspension rates for children with disabilities, I think in the K through 12 system, are high, but it is not higher for children of color in
early childhood.
Yeah.
I think because
so that's not driving it.
Early childhood isn't still 100%, but I think they do a better job addressing special needs than K through 12. Again, it's still not great, but better.
And we do, I should say, in Fussy Baby, we've seen all kinds of babies. We've seen babies with, Down syndrome. And, our work with a lot of those families is to really just, partner with them and, think with them and process with them about just what it was like having a child with a disability. They weren't expecting it. Or they had a different, ideal of the child they were going to have, and having to shift the thinking and what's that like, and, helping them to connect.
That's
with
probably the biggest piece.
Yeah.
Early on. With the whole family system. Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I've enjoyed listening to each of you.
Yes.
And now knowing that you're going to have those soft expulsions, what kind of strategies or policies are you planning to use to address that?
So that's what all the state agencies are trying to decide right now. SB 100, the K through 12 legislation, the data collection piece of that is schools, if a certain school is found to have, for 3 years, I think 20% disproportionality or something, they're put on a school improvement plan. With our early childhood legislation, early childhood is more strengths-based. We don't want to come down and punish, and so it's more about, if there is a program that's struggling, first of all, how are the state agencies going to monitor all of it, which that's step one. They have to figure that out. But then if we are finding programs that are struggling, how are we going to support them? Because it's the same with that child. If the child is struggling, we're going to support them. So what are we going to do for that program to improve their quality? And that's a much heavier lift and much longer struggle. To give an example of best practice, infant and early childhood mental health consultation that Michelle was talking about. So that's a resource for programs, and a mental health consultant can partner with a program to work with that staff. They don't work directly with the kids or the families to provide therapy. It's strictly for the staff to think through challenging behaviors, or even the structure of their policies and procedures, the structure of their classroom. And currently that resource is available to child care programs. The Department of Human Services provides mental health consultants. There are 20-some across the state, but there are only 20-some across the state. And for instance, I know one in southern Illinois who serves 14 counties, and it could take her 2 hours to drive to a program to help them. So this resource exists, so that was the part of the legislation that we're like, talk about it, because when I go out and give presentations, I'll get child care providers who are like, what? I can just pick up the phone for free and call this person and they'll come out to my center? And it's like, yes, you can. Or they'll say, yeah, I know I have a mental health consultant, but I call her and she can't come out for 2 months. What do I do till then? So the initial part of this data collection piece is because the legislation does ask programs to contact their mental health consultant. And so we're working with the state agencies and the mental health consultants to start tracking some of this, because it's going to be messy at first. They're going to have wait lists. And so if we can document how long their wait list is, how many programs are calling them for these challenging behaviors, we can then go back to advocate for more funding and say, okay, now we need 12 more mental health consultants in Southern Illinois. Then the question becomes, are there 12 qualified mental health consultants in Southern Illinois? Because we ask that these people have particular expertise in infant and early childhood mental health. Head Start and Early Head Start require that programs contract with a mental health agency. But if you're in Southern Illinois and the only agency you have is your local mental health agency, what if they've only ever worked with adults? Do they know anything about kids? But that's your only resource. So it's chipping away at each little block, and it's a really long process.
And I would think defining and actually putting that in the record, there is such a thing as a soft expulsion, because when you said that, I hadn't looked at those. I'm like, oh, okay. So I learned something from that, and I don't know if we think of expulsion being just kick them out, but some of those smaller things that are happening along the way, you know.
Yeah, it's good to have verbiage for that, because I was like, how am I going to explain this?
Okay.
But and I could say, I think we do a pretty good job at our 4 schools, but we have those other 9 entities that we help with technical assistance, right? There's smaller agencies that don't have the support system that we have at our schools, and how can we encourage them to look closely at the self-expulsion pieces, and if they identify trends, to do their own internal audits of if this is happening or not. That's something to think about for on our end.
Yeah, and your program's starting at 8 weeks, so thinking about what Michelle was saying, building the pipeline, so state preschool programs, if they're starting at age 4, age 3, if we have mixed age classrooms where maybe 4-year-old boys of color are thought to look more aggressive, or 3-year-olds, sorry, to be compared with the 4-year-olds, there's some brewing issues there that need to be addressed. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you stick around and speak to the panelists as well as meet each other.